Hi, I'm Dave Harmon. I'm a editor at the Texas Tribune over environment and climate, and I'm here moderating a panel of some great journalists. We're going to be talking about the 2021 winter storm that struck Texas on Valentine's Day and overwhelmed the electric grid. Most of the state was plunged into darkness for days. What were supposed to be temporary rolling blackouts went on and on and on, and people literally died in their homes from cold. So, we're going to be talking about how that storm affected regular people, what elected officials did or didn't learn from the storm. We're going to talk about how climate change is posing new challenges for public utilities and why so many of us are paying so much for electricity these days. So I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. Maya, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Maya. I'm a freelance columnist for Forbes and a previously staffed climate reporter. And I co host a podcast with Climate Nexus. And yeah, that's me.
Okay, Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily. I covered energy for the Texas Tribune this past year, and I am now covering climate for the Tribune.
And last but not least, Chris.
I'm Christopher Harress. I work for Reckon as the climate and environmental reporter.
Fantastic. Thanks for being here, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Emily, let's start with you because you covered the aftermath of the winter storm pretty extensively. What happened with the Texas electric grid during Winter Storm Uri, and how are people still paying for the fallout?
Sure. Your introduction was really taking me back to living through that too. Um, so the important thing to remember about that winter storm is that every sort of power source failed. So there were wind turbines, solar panels, and gas and coal facilities that had trouble. It wasn't like, any one was you could point a finger to. But the Texas grid really relies on gas-fueled power plants when the demand is high during winter. And so there's been a lot of conversation and change since about the ways in which those plants weren't prepared physically for the cold temperatures, and also the companies that are responsible for actually pulling the gas out of the ground and moving it to gas-fueled power plants. They didn't have the right equipment and weatherization to make sure that gas could keep flowing during that storm. So that was a main issue and focus for us. And the second part of your question, I think, was the way that we're still paying for it. And this gets a little complicated. There's this term called securitization, but you can kind of think of it as a bailout. And the state, after the storm, had to think about this a lot because during the storm, the price of power went to $9,000 per megawatt. And that was the cap. And that's a much, much, much higher price for power than is normal here in Texas. And so, the companies that provide electricity to those of us who were using it, they were having to pay a lot for power. That might be a retail electric provider, or if you're in a rural area, that could be a co-op. And the gas companies also that sell you your gas that you might use for your stove, they too were having to pay high prices for natural gas. So the state decided to sort of bail out these companies, and the way the companies are managing that debt now is it's trickling down to all of us.
Let's talk about how this storm affected regular people. Maya, especially folks with lower incomes, I think really had a hard time with this storm. And so talk about how they were affected and what was your impression of the government's response and the speed of the response?
That's a really good question. Unfortunately, historically, the government has responded slower in low income and predominantly Black communities. So it wasn't a fast enough response. Biden declared a state of emergency almost a week later. And I think that's a reflection of our government and how we treat people of color and low income people. Unfortunately, people were, as you know, many people know here, the power outages were so bad that people were freezing to death in the cold, in the dark. And oftentimes flooding came as well. So this kind of thing, when we see something, big like a weather event, oftentimes low income people can't leave. Whereas someone who's very working class or has money can leave. And so I think that this was another example of how the government does not respond fast enough to low income communities.
You mentioned flooding, and I don't think most people, when they think of this storm, think of flooding because most of us remember lots of ice and snow. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah. So what a lot of people don't know is that pipes were bursting. So if you were in a low income area and you don't have money to fix a pipe, you're in the cold, houses started flooding. So there's a lot of articles about low income Black people talking about their experiences where they were literally had to leave their homes and go outside because it was flooding and the weather conditions were horrible. People were getting hypothermia, people were dying. And flooding is a huge problem in Black communities, especially in the South, due to weather related events. And so that ice melt comes off and it's dangerous. Flooding is really scary because it can suck cars into bodies of water. It leaves people dead due to, drowning. And so I think flooding is something that needs more attention in terms of how it impacts low income communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so let's switch from cold to heat. Um, Emily, we had a really brutal summer last year in Texas. I know in Central Texas, the temperatures were 103, 105, 107 for weeks. And at the same time, these hard freezes have become more common. Um, since 2021, the Texas grid has held up. It hasn't crashed again. Why do you think that is?
There's a couple of reasons. Again, with electricity, it's never a simple answer. Um, I'd say one thing that's important to note is there's just a lot of new types of energy sources that have come online since 2021. So Texas has a hugely significant amount of solar power that has been built in the last few years. And there's also a pretty sizable and growing number of batteries. So there's just more resources and different resources. Um, the other thing we talked a bit about how, weatherization, which is this idea of just preparing infrastructure for the cold. Normally infrastructure here is just left out. It's not protected um, by a building necessarily. So there were laws put in place that required power plants to better prepare their physical infrastructure against the cold. And there were some financial mechanisms that changed. So trying to be sure that more power would be available in tight times. There were some financial changes to incentivize that. And you all may know if you live in Texas that we get these calls now to voluntarily conserve. And it's sort of hard to know, at least for those of us watching from the outside, like how much that really makes a difference. But ERCOT, which operates the grid, has credited people in the aftermath of these tight times for, reducing their power by not running the dishwasher or not doing their laundry. And the last thing I would say is ERCOT, which again is the grid operator. There's a lot of eyes on this agency, right? Like I think a lot of us didn't even know ERCOT existed until the power went out during that freeze in 2021. And that was a big political event. And there's a lot of pressure on them now to not ever let that happen again. As Maya said, hundreds of people died and millions were without power. So they're operating more conservatively, according to people who are watching them, which some say is costing too much money, but you can see the reason why they may be doing that because the pressure is just so high on them never to let that happen again.
Let me go to Chris real quick. we're having more intense, more frequent weather events like the winter storm. You've written a lot about public utilities. What do you think they should be doing, and what should the regulators of utilities be doing to make our power systems more resilient and really help consumers avoid taking a big financial hit?
Yeah, unfortunately, to me, it seems like toughing up these systems and also easing the financial hit on consumers is, on paper at least, kind of a paradox, because it'll just be expensive. And my observations on how utilities operate, they certainly won't be dipping into their large profits, right? Those costs will be passed on to the consumer. But there are a few things that can be done, as Emily mentioned, weatherproofing or weatherization of critical infrastructure. So insulating, flooding defenses, as Maya mentioned, heating and cooling, that's all crucial. And then there's also smart technologies that can immediately react to whatever abnormalities the grid experiences. But then at the same time, we have to diversify the energy sources, which I know Texas actually has in the past done a great job of, but that needs to happen more. In the same way you would diversify income streams or stocks against swings in the market, you need to have different ways to get at your power. And I think that has to include a greater emphasis on renewables, and then, as Emily mentioned, energy storage solutions, or I think that batteries, basically. And that technology will be really crucial for the future, and also for people who want to get off the grid. And that might be expensive in the short term, but there's research now that shows that these changes will eventually lead to less expensive utility bills in the future. But in an era of maximizing profits alongside minimizing investment and overheads, I'm not confident our utility bills will ever go back to a point where people will open their bill and not thoroughly be annoyed. And so I think the utility commissions have to come together and sort of do what's for the consumer instead of doing what's right for the power companies. I think that's the only way to break that and give us a better deal,
Yeah, absolutely. Emily, I want to ask what you're hearing from climate scientists about what the future is looking like with our weather patterns in Texas and other places.
Sure.
And really, for all three of you, I'm interested in who you think is going to be impacted the most by even more extreme weather.
Yeah, what we were just talking about was really making me think, here in Houston, I've been a reporter here for years now, and we always talk about how every hurricane is different. Just because you've covered one hurricane doesn't mean that you know how to cover the next one. It could be rain is really heavy or the wind is the big problem. And it's the same with winter storms, is what I was just thinking about as we're like trying to figure out, or we're watching governments wrestle with how to prepare, or utilities wrestle with how to prepare. Like Winter Storm Uri was a huge problem with power generation, but we've had winter storms since where the issue was that trees were falling on power lines. So it's just like this need to adjust, not for just the storm that we just experienced, but for all sorts of, climate scientists now use this weird weather phrase. So to answer your question, the expectations are that the heat is going to get worse. So sort of like this feeling of summer starts earlier, the summer is more intense, lasts longer, temperatures just overall are going to be rising. The rains that fall are going to be more likely to be harder rains. And the hurricanes, which again, we think about a lot here on the Gulf Coast, the storms that form are going to be more likely to be stronger. And there's a lot of conversation too. You mentioned that it feels like for us, we're getting a lot more of these winter storms. There's a lot of research into what's known as the jet stream, which is sort of like this huge force that dictates when the cold air from the Arctic makes its way down to us. So there's a lot of research into how the jet stream may be changing and how that's going to affect winter storms here. So it really does feel like we're kind of like already experiencing this different world, and that's only going to continue changing as we keep burning greenhouse gases. And I can let the others speak to this idea of climate justice, but I would say overarching is this concept that the impacts of climate change do not affect people equally. And as utilities and governments and communities are thinking about what needs to be done in anticipation of climate change, that really has to be considered and taken into account, that lower income communities of color have a history of bearing an environmental brunt that is worse. And that could very well be true with climate change if it's not addressed.
And yeah, Maya, I wanted to throw that question to you as well. And actually, your camera, we're losing the top of your head here. But there you go. So how do you see climate change impacting, more vulnerable communities?
That's such an important question. I do want to acknowledge that 56% of Black people are in the South, and our average annual income per household is $48,000. So, for Black people who are low income, just to start, um, there are so many issues that affect us, whether it's water pollution, whether it's, air pollution, all these different things. And what journalists can do is reach out to people in low income areas, but not abandon them after they tell the story. That's a huge thing to me, is that I actually stay in touch with my sources, at least my Black sources who are from low income areas, because a lot of sources feel used. And I want people to tell the stories of low income people, but not just through a traumatic lens. There's so much good happening in the environmental movement in low income areas, especially with Black women. We have been the backbone of this country and the movements that have come with it. And I think we can support Black women and people from low income areas by telling positive stories that come out of the environmental movement. What are people doing to make the world a better place? So I think that we should focus on that as well, not just the traumatic stories and the weather related events.
Totally agree. That's one of my mom's favorite commentaries to me, is like, why don't you tell some good news? Um, and yeah, there's a lot of positive stories out there that we should and could be telling. Um, Chris, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it's hard. I think Maya and Emily covered most of it. Of course, the most vulnerable in society will suffer these effects, as they always have throughout history. In terms of what kind of weather we're expecting, I speak to atmospheric scientists occasionally, and they always tell me that they get a lot of stick for not being able to predict what's coming in the future. And I in some of the predictions, for example, I don't think we knew that the Atlantic hurricane season, for example, would be so light these last 2 years. And just educating people about why that happened. The El Nino sort of, these winds, they rip the tops off of developing tropical storms, and just getting that kind of information out there to help people understand why these patterns change. Because a lot of people that live down here, they'll say, well, climate change can't be real. I mean, we just had the very light Atlantic hurricane season, and then you sort of have to explain that this is a temporary thing, and actually the Pacific hurricane season, for the same reason, was really, really bad. And so getting all that out there, I think, is really important to just helping wider society understand what's going on and why. And I think the more information, the better. And that's kind of my little piece to that. I think Maya and Emily really hit all the best points there.
So Chris, let me stay with you, because you've been writing about utilities in Alabama. And why are we paying so much for power in your state, Texas, and other parts of the country? And how do politics play into those utility bills?
Yeah, this has kind of been my little campaign for a while, like at work and privately, because people are furious. But yeah, I think clearly our changing climate is not helping. But I don't think at this moment that's even the biggest issue. And I think what has pushed our bills up and is when we all started working from home and offices cleared out. So power companies in my opinion, looked at this as an opportunity to kind of play with their income models. So in Alabama, at least, businesses pay cheaper rates, and I imagine it's probably the same in Texas, because they use more power. But with more people working from home, I think that model had to shift to account for the loss in revenue. And so in Alabama, we saw that adjustment happen in 2022 when we had 4 rate increases. And that was, and from what I remember, that was kind of when that working from home thing really became our future. Like that's when we started to say, and then at the same time, our utility bills started going up. And so then we had other narratives kind of muddy the water. You know, the war in Ukraine started in February 2022. That disrupted the commodity supply. Russian sanctions exacerbated the market prices. And we were told that led to higher overheads. But if you were to read Southern Company's quarterly reports, that's the second largest utility company in the country and the owner of Alabama Power, business is really good. And those overheads have come down drastically. But what's not come down is our bills. The Guardian recently reported that around 50% of companies in the US have kept high prices without having any reason aside from making more profit. And so some are calling that greedflation, right? And so you see that across all markets, from eggs to diapers. The difference for utilities, and this is where we get into the politics of it, is these state commissioners are literally charged with preventing this type of price gouging. They're supposed to be the gatekeepers, right? And this was exactly why the first utility commissions were established in like the early 1900s. And so the Alabama Public Service Commission was recently asked why our bills were higher than ever. And the answer was that it was Joe Biden's war on fossil fuels. And so then you have to start asking who these commissioners are, who do they represent, whether they're funded by the same utilities they're supposed to regulate. And the answer to that is yes, they are funded by those same utilities. And so Twinkle Kavanaugh, which is a real name, she's the Republican president of our Utilities Commission in Alabama. And what I've sort of discovered looking at these commissions around the country is they're run by overwhelmingly middle-class white people who are, in Alabama's case, kind of like the golden retrievers of their parties. They'll do anything to kind of be involved. And then at the same time, look at where they get their campaign contributions from and what they say publicly. And I'll just end with this. Almost a year ago, Twinkle Kavanaugh tweeted a picture of herself in front of a huge mountain of coal down on Alabama's Gulf Coast at the coal terminal. And her tweet said, "I love coal." And so there's examples like that all across the country when you really dive into what these commissioners are saying publicly. And I really think that's all you need to know about how utility companies have infiltrated state politics. And it might be a little clue as to why our bills remain so high. And so, yeah.
Well, I know in Texas, the Public Utility Commission, voters don't get to elect those folks. They're appointed by the governor. Is that the same
Yeah.
case in Alabama?
Yeah, I can't remember the breakdown. It's like there's 40 states, I think, have a point, and then maybe 10 have elections, something like that.
Okay, so there's no accountability at the ballot box for the supposed watchdogs.
That's what it seems like. People often say, "Well, make yourself heard at the polls," and I think there's in Mobile, at least where I live, there's a kind of a loud campaign to get Twinkle Kavanaugh out of office. But there are two problems, and I think that show how the price of our utilities are kind of connected or intersect with different parts of our life, whether it's war in a far-flung part of the world or the way in which we vote, and like straight ticket voting, which I don't know if you have that in Texas or not, but we have that here in Alabama. And it's kind of like 2/3 of people in Alabama use that system. So it gives this illusion of choice. But in fact, what it really does is it plays on our human urge to cut corners and get back to our increasingly like busy lives. You just kind of tick one box and off you go, right? But even if Twinkle Kavanaugh was to be voted out, which I don't think will happen, who takes her place? A Democrat can't win that race, so it'll be another Republican who will kind of be basically instructed to continue things as normal or face the wrath of the party. So they'll just find the next golden retriever. And Alabama Power pays for a lot of the political campaigns in Alabama and is extremely powerful, and they usually get their way. So there doesn't appear to be a way out of this in the near term. I think there has to be a major cross-country campaign for change. It's one thing to go without a meal or driving your car for short distances, but we need utilities. And it's the same thing in home and car insurance. Like, we need these things. And I think that need is being leveraged against us. And I think it's a real shame.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about things people can do in their own homes. Energy efficiency has gotten a lot of attention, although in Texas, not a lot of attention from elected officials. So Emily, how could energy efficiency change things for the Texas grid?
Yeah, I think what Chris said is just so important. It's like we are experiencing these now deadly heat waves and freezes. And so to go without air conditioning, which people may have to do if their bills are too high, suddenly becomes a health risk. So in Texas, we are just seeing records continually broken for how much power is used on the grid. And that's both a function of more businesses and people here, and also a reflection of this weather we're experiencing. So environmental advocates that I talk with say, one solution to that is to get more power production on the grid, but an equally valid solution to that is to reduce how much power is being drawn from the grid. So that's where this energy efficiency term comes in. And for everyday people, that might mean, windows that are better keeping the air temperature in your home, or insulation in your home or in your roof. And you're right that these groups who have been pushing for these ideas for a while are really just having trouble getting bills through the legislature. So it's a point that they're continuing to try to make. And at the level of the regulators, the utility regulators here in Texas, they have just begun a program that allows people with Tesla power, like these kind of batteries manufactured by Tesla in certain cities, they're allowed to sell that power if they have excess power back to the grid. So it begins to kind of I don't know. I'm fascinated by it because you can start to think about electricity in a whole new way. Like, what if there's a future in which more people have solar panels on their rooftops and more people have electric cars? So maybe they're charging their cars at night when there's a lot more power available on the grid, rather than 5 p.m., right when they get home. Or maybe if they're generating power on their roof, but they don't need it all, there's a way to sell it back into the grid. So once you sort of begin to hear these ideas, it does make you think like, oh, wow, we can consider the way we use power totally differently. And I think the argument that people make is climate change and this increasing demand for power as we electrify more is that's got to be a part of the conversation, in their opinion.
Right. And for people who have trouble paying for their power bills, swapping out their windows and doing all the things that you're talking about with energy efficiency, which probably isn't realistic with their budget. So it seems like we need elected officials to find some solutions for especially lower income folks who can't, they don't have the money to invest that much into their homes. So Chris, real quick, for people who want to just ditch their power company and switch to solar or renewables, again, these are big ticket costs. What options do they have?
Well, there's a lot of government incentives, and some states have incentives, and the federal government has incentives to help people get better insulation, afford solar panels, and put better, more insulated windows on their homes. But I think when it comes to solar, I think we're really starting to see this fork in the road in the role of solar and the public's role in providing excess power to the grid, which Emily was mentioning. And I see it like this: utility companies can either embrace solar and other renewables and provide our power from those sources, or allow us to do it independently, and then they can buy that back from us. And so one example in my family is my dad lives in Australia, and he's had solar panels for 20 years. And for 10 of those years, he gets a check from the power company every month. And I believe it was the same in California until they lowered the incentives this year. I think that passed, and what the power company would give customers for their power. And so that shift that we're seeing in California, a very progressive place when it comes to power production and renewable power production, is that the new competition for power companies are customers. We're the new competition. And I think they're like, well, we can't afford to send checks to everybody. And so they're now making it less lucrative to put solar panels on your house. And I understand it to some extent. I mean, they need money to build infrastructure and ensure that we have a resilient grid, even if it's not always needed by everyone. And in Alabama, for example, it's more expensive to have solar panels. They charge a solar tax to have them here. That fee is called the reservation capacity fee, and it's intended to cover the cost of having power available for solar customers when their panels are not producing enough to meet their needs, right? And so that fee was recently challenged by environmental groups. But just to go back to the politics of it all, that was dismissed by the Public Service Commission. So, but as battery technology improves and becomes cheaper, I think people will be able to leave the grid entirely. And so that fork in the road again is, how do power companies prevent that exodus? They need to produce power from renewable sources at a fair and equitable rate if they're to prevent that. That's at least how I see it.
Absolutely. Reminds me of the fees that the state of Texas charges for electric car owners, which Emily wrote about, because they're not paying gas taxes. So Maya, I want to end with you with kind of a bigger picture question. What's the most important thing you've learned writing about and working in the climate justice space?
I would say the most important thing I've learned about writing and working in the climate justice space is that Black people are incredibly resilient, and that Black will always be beautiful, as ugly as our lives can get.
Well, that is the time we've got. Maya, Chris, Emily, thank you for your time and thank you for your thoughts, and appreciate you being here and talking about these issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.